Good evening, and welcome to SkepTalk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm president of Bay Area Skeptics. I'll be your host tonight. Our speaker tonight is Adrienne Mayer. She is a research scholar in the Department of Classics and History and in Philosophy of Science at Stanford University, as well as a Berggruen Fellow at Stanford Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. She's a folklorist and historian of science whose interests range widely, from whether mythical griffins were inspired by fossils of Protoceratops to Native American and ancient Greek and Roman interpretations of prehistoric fossils, to the origin of legends of warrior women, to unconventional techniques in ancient warfare, to our topic tonight, the roots of artificial life in antiquity. This is not an exhaustive list of her books either, but it should give you an idea of the range of interests they span. Her books have won numerous awards and have been translated into, and I actually went out and counted this, French, Italian, Spanish, German, Greek, Turkish, Russian, Korean, Hungarian, and Chinese. My books have not. This gives you a little bit of an idea of the breadth of interest in her ideas, which is not just national, but international. She's been a guest on many podcasts, including Sean Carroll's Mindscape, which many of you are familiar with. And when I was researching this introduction, I noticed that Adrienne was Facebook friends with some very well-known skeptics, such as former SkepTalk speaker and friend of Bay Area Skeptics, Daniel Loxton. It turns out Adrienne has been a big help over the years to Daniel as he wrote the now lamentably departed Junior Skeptic. He wrote, and he doesn't know I'm quoting him on this, but I don't think he'd mind. She's been very generous with me over the years. Many of my Junior Skeptic stories covered ground going back to Antiquity, and she was always happy to help with citations and translations on topics from the Kraken to mermaids to haunted houses to werewolves. When I wrote about ghost ships, I had to learn a lot about derelict ships as a shipping hazard. Who wrote the most useful overview? Mayer. So thanks, Adrienne, for your contributions to skepticism, whether or not you actually knew you were making those contributions. Welcome to Bay Area Skeptics.
Thank you so much. Thanks to you, Jeannie, and also to Daniel. Kind words. Thank you.
He's a good guy and a good friend. I think he's listening tonight, as a matter of fact. So if he is, Daniel, we got your back. We are both in the Bay Area, which lately has been pretty nice for us at Bay Area Skeptics, for Jay and I behind the scenes, because so many of our guests have been from other parts of the country, but you and I are right here across the bay in the rain.
So we're in the same time zone.
Yeah, that's a real treat right there.
Yeah.
Why don't we get started? Because I know that our listeners are really looking forward to hearing you and what you can tell us about this extremely interesting topic of artificial intelligence, artificial life, the ancients, and what that can tell us about issues that we're concerned with today about ethics and the use of such information. So, Adrian, take it away.
Thank you. Well, thanks for inviting me to talk with Bay Area skeptics tonight about how artificial life was imagined in ancient Greece. And I thought I would just start with the question that got me interested in the subject in the first place. Who first imagined robots, automatons, and even artificial intelligence? I knew that historians of technology usually trace the first self-driven machines to the Middle Ages using clockwork mechanisms. And I even read that some philosophers of science have argued that no one in antiquity could imagine automatons before the technology existed. Now, that claim made me skeptical. After all, how does anything get invented unless people imagine things that don't yet exist? So I wondered, was it possible that the idea, the concepts of making artificial life, automatons, and even AI could have appeared much earlier than anyone thought? Could people in antiquity imagine such things before the technology to make self-moving machines ever made them possible? And the surprising answer is yes. It turns out that more than 2,500 years ago, in the time of Homer, some vivid Greek myths envisioned how one might fabricate artificial life, robots, and synthetic beings. These animated, self-moving creations were made what could be called made via biotechne. That's not a Greek word, that's not an ancient Greek word, but it is Greek for life through craft in ancient Greek. And that word, of course, leads to our word biotechnology, and the concept did exist in antiquity. So long before the technological innovations of the Hellenistic era, which begins in the 4th century BC, before that time period when animated statues and other machines were actually possible, there were imaginative ideas about creating artificial life that were being explored in Greek myths in what we might call ancient thought experiments. In the ancient texts, the mythical artificial replicas were often described as beings that were made, not born. And that phrase is really important. That is, they were manufactured, not born or reproduced biologically. That phrase, made, not born, that's a crucial distinction between natural and unnatural, biological and artificial, human and non-human. So I'm not just talking about lifeless objects or inert materials brought alive by a magic spell or a god's command. We're talking about entities that were made by the gods using familiar tools and materials of the day. And these synthetic beings were imagined as products of technology in the ancient myths. Because the makers were gods, they achieved awesome results, as we'll see. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with many of these myths about creating imitations of nature in antiquity. Marvelous automatons appeared in the ancient Greek myths about Jason and the Argonauts. He and the Argonauts battled bronze robots in the form of androids and animals. They appear in the myths of the firebringer Prometheus and the tale of Pandora, the artificial woman created by Hephaestus, the god of invention. So tonight, I thought we would look at some classical Greek stories that feature automatons from 2,500 years ago. And these are the earliest imaginings of what we call robots and replicants. Basically, these myths are some of the first ever science fiction stories. Well, let's start with the very first robot to walk the earth, in mythology, that is. And I'm talking about Talos. Talos was a giant bronze automaton made by the god of invention and technology, Hephaestus, blacksmith god. And this myth is very ancient, first written down in about 700 BC and probably circulated centuries before that. Talos was a killer robot that defended King Minos' kingdom of Crete from invaders. This giant bronze man was self-moving. It was said he could march around the island of Crete 3 times a day. And Talos was, you could say, programmed to spot invaders, and then he could hurl boulders to sink approaching ships. And there are coins from Antiquity that actually depict Talos hurling stones. These are a couple examples. And I just want to point out that on the other side of this particular Talos coin, there's another fabricated guardian that helped to defend Crete for King Minos. And that is the golden wonder dog, sometimes called Laylops. He was an artificial hound made of gold that never lost his prey. And like Talos, this golden hound was made by Hephaestus. And here's a vase painting of Laylops, the animated wonder dog. And I think this is interesting just to see this modern impression of Laylops as a robot dog. It's really, I'm sure that the game maker never saw this ancient, very obscure ancient vase, but the images are quite similar. Well, returning to Talos, in close combat, this bronze automaton could heat his metallic body red hot. Then he would grab up victims and crush them to his chest, roasting them alive. And this bronze mirror back, illustrates this capability, made in about 450 BC. Remarkably, we even know something about the inner workings of this bronze android. The details, I think, really confirm his technological origins in the imagination. Talos had a single tube or artery running from his head to his foot. Instead of blood, what pulsed in this artery or tube was Icor. So Talos was thought of as a kind of android machine powered by Icor. What is Icor? Icor is the mysterious life force of the gods. His entire vivasystem was sealed with a bronze bolt at his ankle. So he actually fits the modern, although controversial, definition of robot, the general idea of a robot. He's self-moving, he interacts with his environment, he has inner workings and a power source. In the Argonautica, the epic poem by Apollonius of Rhodes about Jason and the Argonauts, they encountered Talos on their quest for the Golden Fleece when they tried to drop anchor in Crete. Well, I hope there's some classical movie buffs in the audience tonight. I hope so, because I have a lot of film influences in this talk. After all, science fiction movies and myths seem to have a lot in common. They're both sort of cultural dreams. Anyway, this is Talos as imagined by Ray Harryhausen. Familiar to many people if you're fans of this vintage cult movie, Jason and the Argonauts from 1963, and the movie featured the unforgettable stop-motion animation figures and scenes created by Harryhausen. Well, to go back to the ancient myth, Jason and the Argonauts were doomed to become the victims of Talos when they tried to land at the island of Crete. And Talos was portrayed as a giant bronze man. And you can see that the artist means for us to see him as bronze if you just compare the artist's techniques for painting bronze armor. It's exactly the same color and the same sort of rivets and seams. Jason and his men were saved from Talos by the powerful sorceress Medea. And it was this resourceful and clever witch, Medea, who figured out how to destroy the bronze robot. And she used a combination of persuasion and technology. In one version of the myth, Medea was able to hypnotize Talos. In another version, she somehow convinced Talos that she could make him immortal. She promised that she could make him immortal, but only if he allowed her and Jason to remove that vital bronze bolt on his ankle. He was unaware of his own nature. After all, he has Icor flowing in his body. That is what makes the gods immortal. He didn't realize that. And he agreed. Medea and Jason then unsealed the bolt so that his power fluid, the Icor, would bleed out. And this idea of using a tool to dismantle Talos, that's really an ancient idea. It goes back at least to the 5th century BC, because we have vase paintings. Here's an example showing Jason using a tool to remove the bolt on the figure's ankle, and that is his weak point, obviously. So Talos was imagined as made with technology, and he was destroyed with technology. In the myth, the bronze robot's Icor was said to flow out like molten lead. He toppled over and collapsed. Ancient Greek texts and artworks depicted Talos as a metallic robot, but with some human features. So we could say that he was imagined as a kind of cyborg-like creature, a kind of machine-human hybrid. And Medea, she's kind of a techno-wizard of antiquity. She guessed that Talos had developed some human-like desires. Even though he was powered by Icor, he feared death. He wished to be immortal. That's what she promised him. And Talos could be persuaded and fooled by Medea. And that's really another human feature of this ancient robot. Well, psychologists try to understand why do we tend to anthropomorphize robots and feel empathy for them? We seem to be kind of hardwired to bestow emotions on things that somehow seem alive. And studies show that happens, especially if they have a name and a kind of backstory of their creation. And Talos certainly had that. Well, some of you might remember the famous Stanley Kubrick movie 2001, A Space Odyssey. And there's an iconic scene there where the computer Hal, he seems most human to us when he's being deactivated by the astronaut. As Hal is dying, he tells his name and he starts to recite memories from his childhood. So he also has a name and a backstory that make us feel empathetic. In the 1963 film Jason and the Argonauts, despite the expressionless face of the bronze automaton in the movie, the astonishing animation sequence manages to suggest glimmers of personality and intellect in Talos. He's portrayed sympathetically in the poignant movie scene. As his life fluid bleeds out, the great robot struggles to breathe and he clutches his throat while his bronze body cracks and crumbles. And the modern audience feels pity for this helpless giant. Human qualities are what make the robot's destruction feel tragic to us. And just like in Antiquity, people feel sympathy for the robot who was tricked and killed while simply doing his job. And we know that there was a tragedy, a play in Antiquity about Talos. It's lost now, but he was treated tragically by a playwright as well. And in this ancient vase painting on the right, made 2,500 years ago, the dying Talos is shown as a large man of bronze, and he's swooning or falling backwards after Jason has removed the bolt. And his eyes are rolling back, and the artist has even painted what appears to be a teardrop falling from his eye. The ancient idea of a metallic automaton guard or guardian cast in human form like Talos, that really captured the imagination of artists in the Middle Ages. I was interested to see that there are several medieval examples in ancient manuscripts from the Middle Ages. Here's a painting from about 1350. Alexander the Great is fighting two robots made of gold. They're guarding a bridge. That's the upper left of this slide. And then we see Alexander and Lancelot. We see Alexander at the top left. And then in the center, we see Lancelot. And also on the lower right, Sir Lancelot in the medieval tales of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. He also fought metallic robots guarding a castle, and they were inspired by Talos of Greek myth. And I think this is really interesting, that this idea of the metallic robot really just travels all the way through the Middle Ages. On the left, you see a robotic knight that was invented by Leonardo da Vinci in about 1495. And a century later, the idea was taken up by the poet Edmund Spenser in his epic poem written in 1596. Spenser sort of retools the bronze robot Talos that guarded Crete for King Minos as the Iron Knight. The Iron Knight was a grim enforcer companion for Sir Artegall. You see the two of them there. Artegall is a seeker of virtue, and Spenser named his iron automaton knight Talus, inspired by Talus from Antiquity. And in the poem, the Iron Knight was a relentless killer robot without mercy. I think this poem from 500 years ago provides some interesting jumping off point for thinking about modern AI and the question of justice, or whether justice could be administered by AI. Some people have suggested that, and Spenser is actually calling that into question 500 years ago. Well, going back to antiquity, one might ask, what could have inspired the ancient mythographers and artists who first described and illustrated Talos? Some have suggested that the Mediterranean island of Sardinia might have been involved. Not too long ago, archaeologists excavated about 40 colossal stone statues on Sardinia. These were made in the Nuragic period, so that's about 900 to 600 BC. And there are about 40 of these. They're about 10 feet tall, placed around the island. This kingdom of Sardinia had close trading ties with Minoan Crete. And notably, some ancient Greek writers in antiquity reported that Talos had originally defended Sardinia before he came to protect Crete. And these bizarrely robotic-looking statues have generated some conspiracy theories of aliens, technology in antiquity, but I think that the simple faces are just a coincidence. It's a pretty amazing coincidence, but it's just a simple face. Archaeologists believe that the strange towering statues were meant to sort of symbolically guard the island of Sardinia against foes. And if that's true, then they would have played a role similar to that of the idea of the bronze automaton Talos on Crete. And some have asked whether it's possible that ancient sailors who did sail around the Mediterranean might have observed or heard described these giant stone guardians that might have influenced the ancient myth of Talos. We don't really know. Another possible ancient influence of the idea and image of Talos could be this mysterious seal of the Minoan civilization in Crete, made in about 1450 BC. And it's a seal showing a city and the city gate, and looming over the gate is a giant android figure, perhaps meant to be a guardian, something like Talos. Well, returning to the Greek myth of Jason and the Argonauts, Talos was not the only deadly automaton that the witch Medea helped them overcome. Jason also had to survive the challenge of a pair of fire-breathing bulls made of bronze. In order to win the Golden Fleece, Jason had to accomplish a set of impossible tasks. And one of those tasks was to subdue 2 hulking bronze bulls that could breathe fire. These fearsome robo-bulls were, of course, forged by Hephaestus for King Aeetes of Colchis, the land where Medea came from. And Jason had to yoke these fire-breathing bronze bulls to a bronze plow. And these coins show Jason having yoked the bronze bulls to a plow. In the myth, then, Jason has to plow a field with these bulls and plant dragon's teeth in the furrows that he has plowed. The dragon's teeth are going to instantly sprout an army of invincible warriors who are programmed to attack Jason and the Argonauts. And Jason has to defeat this multiplying army of android soldiers. And all this has to be done in one day before nightfall. To protect Jason from the fiery breath of these bronze bulls and the terrifying army that's going to arise from the planted dragon's teeth, Medea mixed an ultra-powerful drug. She traveled to the mountain where Zeus, the king of the gods, had chained the fire-bringer Prometheus. And he did this to punish Prometheus for giving the stolen technology of fire to human beings. Zeus had commanded Hephaestus to construct a drone-like eagle. The descriptions in the Argonautica are very machine-like. It came at the same time every day to torment Prometheus, and it had a kind of whirring sound of the way its wings moved sort of mechanically. Medea went there to gather Icor, the divine life force that was dripping from Prometheus's wounds. And you can see the droplets falling in this ancient Greek vase painting on the lower right. So Medea was going to use the same life force that powered Talos to help Jason. This Promethean drug gave Jason superhuman powers and did protect him from fire and from swords. But the effects were they were spectacular, but like any fairy tale, they were temporary. They only lasted one day, long enough for him to carry out his task. The special drug gave Jason incredible strength and courage. And just quoting the passage in the epic poem, as the drug began to circulate in his veins, Jason senses terrifying powers entering his body. His arms began to twitch and flex, his hands clenching at his sides. Jason exults in his superhuman strength and begins to stride and leap about, roaring like a wild beast. Well, normally Jason is depicted in vase paintings as a kind of skinny, modest physique guy. Here he is retrieving the golden fleece with Medea's help, but the drug basically transforms him into the Hulk. So Jason now has the physical and mental power to wrangle those bronze bulls, and many modern artists have been captivated by this idea of metallic bulls snorting flames. It wouldn't be difficult to make a very realistic bronze bull and make it look like it was snorting flames from its nostrils. Here are more illustrations by modern artists of Jason and the bronze bulls. In the myth, the bulls charge at Jason, and flames shoot from their nostrils as though, quote, blasted by bellows from a bronzesmith's furnace, unquote. But Jason's impervious to the fire. He's very brave now. So he is able to survive the searing breath of the bulls. And all day long, he plows that field and sows the dragon's teeth. And it's nearly dusk when the furrows begin to seethe and gleam as these diabolical soldiers with spears and in armor begin to spring up out of the field. And I only have this medieval image of that myth. This is the horrible crop of automatic warriors that Jason must cut down before nightfall. And I can't resist showing the scene of the menacing skeleton soldiers popping out of the ground. It's best known today from the spectacular special effects sequence in Jason and the Argonauts. In the ancient Greek epic, the giant androids in bronze armor spring up from the soil, fully armed, and these uncanny artificial soldiers, they couldn't be ordered or led. There's no one to command them. They're kind of programmed to attack. They cannot retreat. They cannot halt. They're just sort of hardwired. They will attack. And with continuous reinforcements swelling their ranks as they keep popping up out of the ground, these soldiers advance on the nearest enemy, and that would be the Argonauts. And once again, Medea to the rescue. It's Medea who figured out how to take advantage of the encoding imprinted in this unnatural army. She tells Jason to toss a stone to trigger the soldiers' reaction. She realizes that a random impact would start a sort of domino effect, a cascade of blows, causing each of these soldiers to fight the nearest soldier and thereby destroy each other. So Jason does throw a boulder into their midst, and they sense the blows on their bronze armor, on their shields. The giant army, each one of them reacts as though he's been attacked, and each one turns on the other in a confused frenzy, and they're hacking with their swords at each other. And now Jason and the Argonauts manage to finish them off and escape. So if you're facing machines of malice in Antiquity and ancient Greek myth, you definitely want Medea on your side. She's almost an ancient version of a hacker. The bronze bulls and Talos were made, of course, as I mentioned, by the god Hephaestus. Well, Hephaestus had an impressive resume of artificial beings, animated statues and automatons, self-moving devices that he made while in his workshop on Mount Olympus. He's a divine blacksmith. He's the only god with a job, actually. He's the only god who actually sweats. He's always pictured working very hard at his forge. And he's always pictured using familiar tools and materials and methods that people saw in real blacksmith foundries and workshops on Earth. But because Hephaestus was the god of invention and technology, of course, his imaginary creations were marvelous, far beyond what any mere mortal could achieve with the same tools and materials and methods. For example, Hephaestus made 20 automated bellows for his forge. According to Homer in the Iliad, written about 700 BC, the bellows blasted more or less air as the divine blacksmith worked in his workshop with the molten metal. He constructed automatic gates for the heavens so that the gods could come and go without having to get down from their chariots. Hephaestus also devised a fleet of self-driving carts that delivered nectar and ambrosia to the gods' banquets and then returned when they were empty. I mean, you could see modern versions of this on the campus at Berkeley of the food delivery robots. But his most amazing invention was a crew of life-sized, lifelike women made of gold to serve as his personal assistants. Homer describes these golden servants as looking just like real young women. And these female androids anticipated Hephaestus's every need. Homer says they were endowed with strength and with reason. Even more astonishing, I think, Homer says they were equipped with the knowledge of the gods. He says all the knowledge of the gods were bestowed upon these golden maidens. In other words, they possess to what amounts to a mythological version of AI. Well, the capstone of Hephaestus's wonders of artificial life was yet another lifelike replicant, and this one could interact with humans on Earth. This is different from all the others that we have heard about made by Hephaestus on Mount Olympus. In this myth, Zeus commands Hephaestus to fabricate a beautiful female android to punish humans for accepting the divine technology of fire stolen by Prometheus. This project resulted in a realistic artificial woman endowed with deceptive human characteristics. And this marvelous creation was named Pandora. And there are several ancient vase paintings illustrating the myth of Pandora. There are also some sculptural reliefs. Pandora was described by the poet Hesiod around the same time that Homer was describing the golden female servants manufactured by Hephaestus. And they were described with similar terminology. Hesiod's description says that Pandora was an artificial young woman and that she was made, not born. He's emphasizing the technological nature of this creation. And here we have a vase painting showing Zeus admiring Pandora before he sends her to Earth. So this living statue in the form, she's sort of a fembot, in the form of a seductive young woman. She was sent to Earth carrying a sealed jar filled with evils intended for humanity. She was given the mission of opening that fateful jar on Earth and releasing eternal misery on humankind. Well, here's Pandora on the magnificent Niobe vase made in about 450 BC. It's more than a foot tall. It's a magnificent vase showing Pandora at the top center there, being shown off to the gods before she's going to be sent to Earth. And she is being prepared for her mission by the gods, who all contribute something to her making. And the figures around her are lively and active. You can see they're all in motion. But she stands there in the center very stiffly. She's standing there like a statue. She's gazing out at us with an uncanny smile. Now, faces looking straight out at the viewer on vase paintings, that's extremely rare. It usually is used for lifeless things like masks or statues. And facial expressions are also very rare. So the effect on the viewer would have been quite startling in antiquity of this vase. One art historian has said that Pandora looks like a wind-up doll about to be activated. And I can't help another movie reference here. There's an eerie similarity to the evil robot Maria in the classic 1927 silent film Metropolis by Fritz Lang. She too causes chaos and suffering for humanity. And the images of Maria, the evil robot Maria, and Pandora being prepared for their mission is really quite striking, I think. In the Greek myth, Pandora was given as a bride to a man named Epimetheus, who was dazzled by her beauty. And Prometheus tried to warn Epimetheus not to accept Pandora. But Epimetheus was enchanted by Pandora's loveliness, and he welcomes her into his life. And Hesiod tells us only later did Epimetheus realize his terrible mistake. The Pandora myth, what I've just told you, doesn't really track with the one that we're probably most familiar with. In later European fairy tales, this myth was romanticized. Pandora is usually portrayed as an innocent but curious young girl who just can't resist opening a forbidden box of troubles. Modern artists show Pandora reeling back or being horrified as clouds of evil swarm out of the chest. But in the original ancient Greek myth, Pandora, of course, was not an innocent young maiden. Curiosity is never mentioned. It was her mission on Earth to open that vessel filled with evil. She was deliberately fabricated. Hesiod tells us that Zeus commissioned Hephaestus to make a beautiful evil, or beauty, a trap for humans. She was to be evil disguised as beauty. She was intended to devastate humankind. And what about hope, you might ask? The last thing in Pandora's jar. Well, in modern retellings, those romantic fairy tales, hope is often imagined as a kindly fairy who emerges from the chest of the jar to bring comfort to humans. But in classical antiquity, hope was not considered. Hope is always called blind hope. It deprives us of the ability to foresee the future. And since antiquity, philosophers have debated whether hope was the best or the worst thing that escaped or didn't escape from Pandora's jar. In antiquity, some Greek artists depicted hope as a woman with a kind of crooked smile, a kind of lopsided smile, kind of a sly smirk on her face, very similar to the vase painting that shows Pandora with that same uncanny smile. It's kind of a mocking smile. Prometheus, as we saw, tried to warn against Pandora. Now, Prometheus, as you recall, was the one who stole fire from the gods to help the defenseless first humans. And according to some mythic stories, it was Prometheus who created the first man and woman on Earth. I learned about an amazing group of ancient artists who illustrated this particular myth in an extraordinary way. They show Prometheus constructing the first human being from scratch as a product of technology. It's very different from the creation of Adam and Eve or other cultures' myths of humans created just molded from mud and then brought to life by a god's command. Here we see Prometheus making the first human being as a product of technology. He's using tools. The series of exquisitely detailed gems used for seals and rings. There are more than 60 of these. The artists show Prometheus as a kind of engineer. He's an artisan using tools to build the first human prototype from the inside out. Prometheus begins with the skeleton as the framework. Skeletons are also extremely rare in ancient Greek art. So these gems really stand out as a kind of proto-scientific anatomical vision of the first humans being engineered piece by piece, starting with the skeleton. Prometheus is shown using plumb bobs, mallets, strings, and various other tools to build the framework first, and then he will add muscles and flesh to the human forms. So he's envisioned constructing the prototype man and woman body part by body part. And to me, these images call to mind Mary Shelley's science fiction novel, Frankenstein, about a mad scientist who constructs an android out of human body parts. Shelley wrote her novel in 1818, just over 200 years ago. And I really wondered, did she know about these ancient gems? In fact, engravings of these gems were first published and displayed in European cities a few years before Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. And we do know that Shelley was influenced by the myth of Prometheus building the first humans. In fact, Shelley's subtitle for Frankenstein was A Modern Prometheus. These gems and the other examples from literature and art show, I think, that the ability to imagine the idea of making artificial life, automatons, and robots has more ancient roots than most people realize. We can trace these cultural dreams of advanced technology all the way back to the myths of classical Greece, at first written down in the 8th to 7th century BC. Pandora, the metallic bulls that breathed fire, and other beings that were made, not born. They all show that automatons and self-moving devices were thinkable long before the technology to make them was available. We can, as I mentioned, I think we can consider these myths as ancient thought experiments or science fictions. And it's often said that where science fiction leads, technology often follows. And before long, in the Hellenistic period, beginning in the 4th century BC, real inventors in the Greek world began to design and construct working automatons and a variety of marvelous machines and self-moving devices. Examples of these historical devices and moving statues are described in the last chapter of my book, Gods and Robots. One remarkable early invention was the first artificial bird it was actually capable of flight. It was made by Architis, who was a friend of the philosopher Plato in the 4th century BC. Architis was a politician, but he was also a mechanical genius. And we don't have his works, but we have many quotations from his treatises by other Greek writers. And engineers today believe that Architis's flying bird model, which could apparently fly a few feet in the air and then had to be reset to fly again, was probably driven by steam in some way. But soon after that, brilliant craftsmen, engineers, inventors such as Hero of Alexandria and Philo of Byzantium began working in Alexandria in Egypt, the home of the great library, and also the museum, which was a network of workshops and labs. A lot of these innovators flocked to Alexandria at that time. And these innovators designed and constructed a profusion of miniature and monumental animated statues, self-moving servants that could serve wine, dispense napkins or other things, singing birds, roaring dragons, Heracles with a bow and arrow killing a dragon, little automatic theaters, and other mechanical marvels of the Hellenistic period. And if you're ever in Athens, I highly recommend the Katsanis Museum of Ancient Greek Technology, where he has working models from the descriptions in the treatises by Hero and Philo and other engineers and inventors. Several astonishing animatronic statues were displayed in the grand procession of King Ptolemy II in 279 BC in Alexandria. He was the ruler of Alexandria at that time of great innovation. And one of the most impressive automatons was a colossal figure of the goddess Nysa, who was seated on a throne. She was about 10 feet tall when she was seated. And periodically, along the route of several kilometers, this gigantic goddess stood up and poured a libation of milk from a jug into a bowl and then sat down again. And this must have really been a robust automaton to do this over and over again along the route in a stately manner befitting a goddess. It took 300 men to pull her cart or float in this lavish spectacle. Engineers today have written articles figuring out how that automaton actually must have worked. Meanwhile, I don't want to conclude before pointing out that the Greeks were not unique in devising automatons, android warriors, and elaborate mechanical devices. These things appear in ancient India and China in both mythology and legends and in real life. One of my favorites is an Asian legend that claimed that robotic warriors deep underground defended Buddha's bodily relics after his death until they were distributed several centuries later. Well, to conclude, we live in a time of grandiose ambitions, futuristic goals, to reimagine humanity on the brink of what advanced technology is making possible, but also problematic. It might seem ironic to be looking back to the distant past. I've asked you to time travel more than 2 millennia to look at what are essentially some of the first science fictions. But I think the sophistication of these ancient dreams of technology really enrich our understanding of the timeless link between imagination and science. And I also think that the more we know about what ancient people were capable of envisioning or imagining and actually building, the better we are able to deflect claims of aliens and their other archaeological conspiracies. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up the notion of the relevance to our recognition of the really long history of the creation of artificial life. I was several months ago now, I guess it must almost be almost a year ago, was last winter, we had an archaeologist, A.J. White, talking with us about, he's a student at Berkeley, probably finished his degree by now, talking about precisely that issue, that there's this assumption that people who are not exactly like us don't have our imagination, don't have technical abilities to do things that we that clearly they were able to do. Clearly the Egyptians were able to build the pyramids. They did not really have to have assistance. But I think many of us are familiar with machines like the sideshow fortune teller. Put in your quarter and it will tell your fortune. But it's fascinating how far back in the past the idea of machine life goes. I mean, I really thought that was really fascinating.
Thank you.
Talos is an interesting creature. I was looking through, as I was preparing your introduction, I was quite interested to discover that there's actually a musical composition about Talos that was performed at UC Berkeley, inspired by your book. I didn't know about that. I didn't attend the concert, but could you tell us just a little bit about that? Because that's unusual, to say the least.
That was one of the most amazing invitations that I have ever received about my work, was to talk about Talos at the premiere of that particular Greek. It's a Greek composer wrote a piece inspired by Talos, and it premiered in San Francisco and then in Berkeley, and it's also traveled to Athens and a few other places. So it was really exciting to meet them. I didn't get to go in person because it was during COVID. So we Zoomed, but then later they came to my house to film an interview that they would use for performances, and I got to meet the composer and one of the musicians. So that was really a rewarding experience, quite amazing.
Well, I can imagine that must have.
The composer had invented a new instrument specifically for the piece called the ghost plate, which has a very eerie sound to it. So it's quite an experience. Yeah.
That's cool. That's very neat. Well, a more serious topic. As I was listening to you in the beginning, you mentioned that we tend to empathize with machines that exhibit human-like characteristics. I think that's very true, and I think that's that's really an issue that brings up ethical concerns as well about
Absolutely.
the human use of machinery. Now, obviously, the Greeks and the people in the Middle Ages whose work was really quite astonishing. As you say, they could imagine it and they could make it, but not like we can make it today, so to speak. We can
Right.
make we have a great deal more in terms of technological expertise for making really quite remarkable things, and not necessarily putting them together like Mary Shelley imagined it from pieces left over. But I'm thinking, and here we go again. There was a movie out a couple of years ago, very eerie movie. Involving a man. I'm going to give away the ending if you haven't watched it, so put your fingers in your ears, listeners. The end, you might remember the end scene, even if I can't remember the name of the movie. He gets locked inside this building with no way out. It's this lovely palace almost out in the middle of no place that's owned by a wealthy industrialist who's been creating robots that
Yes.
are indistinguishable from living humans.
Yes.
And the young man who is sort of brought there to sort of figure out if he can figure it out. And eventually the robots kind of, as is so typical in fiction and science fiction, they revolt against their masters. Do you remember the name of that movie?
I don't remember. I know exactly the movie
You
you're
know the
thinking
movie, yeah,
of,
neither of
but
us
I
can
can't
remember.
think of it. I can't think of the title. But
Yeah.
she escapes at the end.
She
Doesn't
escapes,
she?
but he doesn't. Yeah, she
Yeah.
escapes, and you sort of you think, is there going to be a sequel? What havoc is she going to wreak on on the world? But what is the ex machina? Thank you,
Ex
David Allman
Machina.
Smith.
Thank
Yay!
you.
Thank you, David. Woo!
Yes.
Our Bay Area skeptics are with the popular culture, even if I.
Good.
But in all seriousness, that movie really brought up a lot of ethical issues. What is the ethics of making a creature that is so human that you cannot tell it apart from live human beings? Is I don't know. In another type of technology, the question is raised: is it ethical to reverse engineer elephants into mastodons or mammoths? I guess it would have to be
Right.
mammoths, not mastodons.
That's right. That is a parallel problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I have issues. Well, I have never spoken with Alexa or Siri, and I prefer. I don't like smart machines. I don't have any in my house. But I think I'm really disturbed by the idea that corporations are attempting to make robots that are supposed to be our friends and our companions. And, a lot of people are worried about the idea that technology favors tyranny. And, that goes all the way back to these myths. If you think about who is it that's commissioning and deploying, should always ask who is commissioning and deploying these artificial entities. And in the myths, it's always powerful, either the king of the gods, who is very harsh and tyrannical and sadistic. He takes pleasure in sending Pandora. He actually is said to laugh with pleasure when he sends Pandora down to Earth. And
yeah, they do not have our best interests at heart.
No, you should always ask that. And of course, whenever they're making these things, they always the PR is to say how beneficial they're going to be. Like I remember reading about the lip reading AI that they were developing, and what a benefit this would be. But we can all think of the nefarious purposes for all of these things, even though they present them as purely beneficial. So I think we always need to ask who's making them, who's wants to use them, who's commissioning them, and who's going to
who benefits
benefit from this. And there's also the question of, you mentioned that the in Ex Machina the the robots or fembots, I guess, they all escape and run away or rebel. Even in antiquity, Plato and Socrates talk about the made not born figures made by Hephaestus and others like Daedalus, who was famous for making automated statues, that maybe we should chain those so that they don't run away like slaves will. And Aristotle even talked about, he mused on the idea of when he was trying to write a treatise on defending slavery, because as you know, Athens depended on real slaves. He actually said, well, what if we had automatons like those in the Iliad described by Homer? What if we had looms that could weave cloth on their own? What if we had musical instruments that could play themselves? Well, we wouldn't need slaves. And then he just goes on, he just drops it there and moves on to justify having slaves. But he actually defined slaves as living tools. And
yeah.
I agree with the scholars of AI, thinkers who talk about the dangers of AI, like Joanna Bryson and Patrick Lynn, who work on the ethics of AI, the things you're bringing up. They point out that we really should treat AI and these AI-powered entities as our tools. They are not our companions and friends. They're not almost human. We should consider them our property, our tools, because otherwise, who will be responsible if things go wrong or if they cause damage somehow?
Well, there's a couple of issues. Ashok, we'll get to your question in just a sec, but we should finish this thought. There's a couple of issues involved in this. Number one, yes, they are tools, and we obviously have different attitudes about slavery than Aristotle did. We've come to think of it as not a good thing, and that is because the slave is an independent actor with his or her own emotions and feelings and suffering and so forth and so on, and should have the ability to decide for him or herself what the consequences, what the life should be like, and slavery takes that away. If you ever produce an automaton, if you ever produce one of these mechanical creatures that has almost or equivalent human emotions, feels pain, etc., would you not want to make that same argument? So I'm sure that's a whole ethical issue involved in there.
There's a trilogy of science fiction novels based on that very question. I know the author's first name, I can't think of her last name, in which she imagines that in antiquity, Socrates finds out that automatons made in antiquity actually have human characteristics and want to be free, and so he's helping to free them. So that is an important idea. But is it ethical to make automatons that have human emotions?
And then the other part of that, sort of supporting the idea that they are tools and should be treated as tools. There's the little kitties that you give to grandma or to a senior citizen who has no friends or family anymore, and it is a comfort. It sits on your lap and purrs, and they talk to it. That is not a creature that you have to worry about a whole lot having emotions or being enslaved, shall we say, in the service of humans. So, arguably there are machines that can do remarkable things, but they are still machines. And it's only to the degree that they, as you pointed out in your talk, it's only to the degree that they reflect aspects of human behavior or emotion that we empathize with them, that we are concerned about them. Sorry, let's have your question back again.
I was just going to say something about that, and then we'll go to the question. That there's a important book by David Gunkel, published by MIT Press, called Robot Rights. that he's not arguing for robot rights, but he's bringing up all of those considerations that you're discussing and more. He'd be a wonderful person to have on your on these shows. He's, I think, based in Chicago. David Gunkel is his name, and the book is Robot Rights.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, even Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was not a monster like in the movie. I mean, it was a sensitive human being. It was very, very different. Okay, Ashok wants to know. I'm afraid maybe we've gone so far that I'm not sure what this refers to, but perhaps the creation of automatons is a problem. We've enjoyed events where the well-being of the players is okay. I think if I can interpret that question, I think what he is asking is, do we really need to be concerned about the sensibilities, as it were, or the feelings of our created creatures? Maybe.
Well, enjoying events where the well-being of players is no concern. Going back to like gladiator games.
Oh, I misunderstood. Yeah, I think
I'm asking. No, I mean, yes, humans have long enjoyed events where the well-being of the players is of no concern. It's true for football too, of course. Football, hockey, boxing, all these things do provide spectacles for humans.
Dissertation committees. Sorry.
So it's not suddenly a problem. It's a very old problem, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Do we have another question? Jay says you use the term uncanny describing Pandora's smile, which I'm sure, I don't know if I'm sure, was a reference to the uncanny valley.
The uncanny valley. The uncanny valley was invented by a Japanese.
What is the uncanny valley?
Oh, the uncanny valley is the closer an artificial entity approaches being human, there's suddenly we're interested and positive about it until it gets too close. When it's almost human, but not quite. There's something wrong. There's something you can discern that it's not human. Then our good feelings about it crash into an abyss. And those who make AI and robots want to get past the uncanny valley feeling, where we feel negative emotions towards something that's almost human but not quite. It's really interesting that I can't remember he was a maker of robots, but he first experienced the uncanny valley when looking at prosthetics that were meant to look really human, like eyes or hands. And he felt they don't look human enough, but they look almost human. And so you get this horrible, ambivalent, negative feeling about that. I think the uncanny valley probably, that disturbing feeling of being too real but not quite real enough, does go back to antiquity. So I think the viewers looking at that magnificent vase and seeing Pandora looking right out at the viewer with that strange smirk on her face probably felt a kind of uncanny valley feeling. But also, and this goes to making hyper realistic robots that you were mentioning earlier, Jeannie. Of course, in antiquity, all those marble statues and the bronze ones as well, life size and so exquisitely carved, really realistic. Some of them even have veins that you can see. Wow. They were painted realistically in realistic colors. Then they added wax to the pigment so that the skin really looked human. And they had inlaid eyeballs, inlaid fingernails, inlaid eyelashes. And think of seeing these not in electric lights, but at night in a temple just lit by oil lamps or moonlight. You would get an uncanny valley feeling. And we're told by some writers that some of the statues of gods in temples were able to lift their arms or blink their eyes, things like that. So I'm sure there was a sense of uncanny valley in antiquity as well.
Well, where can we see these gems showing Prometheus creating humans? Are they in a museum someplace or pictures?
Unfortunately, they are not all in one place on display. I found them through a wonderful Italian scholar who studies them. And as I say, there are about 65 of them. I illustrate quite a few of them in Gods and Robots in my book, and I give all of the references to which museums they're in. So if you get that book and look at the references, you can then go to the museum and see them that way, where they would have good color photos of them.
Well, it's we do notice that it is the gift-giving time of year, and so I would certainly encourage interested readers to consider gifting themselves your book.
And there's an audiobook of it. I actually read the audiobook.
Did you?
Yes, that was quite another interesting experience, but it was really
and a
fun.
very difficult one. Not everybody can do that. And I noticed actually that you won an award for one of your audiobooks. So, you obviously do this well. Is there a historical movement of golems against robots? Well, that's interesting. Golems are a different kind of robot.
Yes, golems are magical medieval from Jewish legend. So I don't consider them because they're beyond the Antiquity period. I end with about the 1st century AD. But there is a wonderful book by E.R. Truitt, Ellie Truitt, Truitt, called Medieval Robots. And I think she probably talks about golems. But the golem, of course, wasn't built through technology. It was more of a sculpture that was brought to life by a magical spell, by magic words either placed upon the figure or recited to him. If correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I know about golem.
I think that's correct.
Yeah.
So they have two different origin stories.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there another question? I think there was a question, but it was also on golems and robots, and so I think right. The mythology. This seems like.
I see what you're asking. The golems are inert matter like mud or clay or blood.
Stone.
There are stone, things like that are inert matter that is then brought to life or enlivened by a god's command, like in the Old Testament, or by a magic spell. Something like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Believe it or not, the Sorcerer's Apprentice originates in a sort of horror tale written by Lucan in the Roman era. He writes about an Egyptian magician who makes household objects that can turn into robots. And then the Sorcerer's Apprentice was based on that. So
the sort of early Roomba.
Right. But so the golem, I think, magically animated.
It's not
matter.
It's not made.
It's not made. It's not manufactured or fabricated through technology, using tools, methods, and materials that a blacksmith or artisan or engineer would use. Icor is. We don't really know what Icor is. It's imagined as the fluid that flows in the veins of gods instead of blood, and it's what gives them immortality. We do know that the gods can bleed. They do bleed if wounded, but because they're gods, the wounds heal very quickly and they're fine. But as you saw, the Titan Prometheus was bleeding Icor so that Medea could go and collect that to make that drug that she made for Jason. So I guess Icor does have a kind of magical feel to it. But what's interesting about Talos is that in the mythographers, when they describe that single vein, they actually use the biological term vein or artery rather than tube. They use a biological term for that. So once again, he's more like a half human, half machine.
He's conceptualized as being more than just a...
Yeah.
All right. Jay asks, what myths or misconceptions about ancient robots persist with today's robots?
Well, I did mention that some people think that because there are stories of self-moving machines or robots in antiquity that they must have learned how to make these from aliens, but I don't know if from alien visitations. I don't know if that's I didn't see that. Let's see the question again. Am I answering that question? I'm not sure. Misconceptions.
Or just maybe beliefs in general. One carrier, obviously, ancient robots are manufactured. They're
not born. They're specifically not born, and that they can't reproduce. Many people ask me, is there an idea that robots can reproduce themselves? And in antiquity, we don't have that idea. We have the idea of the dragon's teeth keep sprouting more and more soldiers, but it's from each dragon tooth. Now, Ovid, the Roman sort of romantic writer, took the story of Pandora and then when he retold it, he added a boyfriend for her that she then marries, and that they have children together. But
Bride of Frankenstein.
But we never after Pandora in Greek myth, after Pandora opens that jar, we never hear from her again. And then there's the story of Pygmalion, who makes an ivory statue of his version of an ideal woman, a beautiful virgin who's better than any real woman, and he prays to the goddess of love, Aphrodite, to bring that statue alive, and she takes pity on him and brings it to life. There, once again, we have inert matter that's just brought to life by a god's command. And when Ovid tells this story, he says that they have children together, and he names the children. Now, so you can see there's a tendency in antiquity that people wanted these really realistic replicas, artificial people, to actually become so human that they could reproduce. And we have that idea does persist, to go to your question, persists in the Blade Runner science fiction stories. Whereas, especially in Blade Runner 2, 2049, that it's mysteriously the replicant has become pregnant and had a child. So you have that same tendency that Ovid in the Roman era was prey to. He just he anticipates the Blade Runner mystery.
Oh, and of course, the other big carryover is the machineries of the ancient age, the bulls or the humans or the Pandoras or the whoever's are meant to serve either the gods or they're meant to serve humans. They don't have an awful lot of self-actualization, shall we say. I mean, nobody asked Galatea if she wanted to marry this guy and have his kids, right?
No. Although Talos is the first robot that we have in ancient Greek literature, he actually does make a decision on his own. He agrees to allow Medea and Jason to take out the bolt, and so he has human volition,
right?
Which is rather amazing for the earliest story we have.
Yeah. Well, again, the more similar they become to us, the more Yeah, and the more we sympathize with them.
Yeah.
We could talk all night, but we have kept it for a long time, and we very much appreciate it. Let me thank you profusely for joining us this evening. It was
Thank
really
you for
fun
inviting
having
me.
you.
It was
Well,
really fun.
we tend to do a lot of straight up science in various skeptics, but it's really good and healthy for us to need to think outside our normal kinds of presentations and our normal way of looking. Think about imagination and think about how all these things work together. Because
That's
what's
right.
science without imagination? Also,
Absolutely.
all right.
Correct.
Thank you
Well,
again.
thank you so much.
This
I
was
really
fun.
enjoyed it.
So, folks, let me tell you about next month's talk. Next month's talk is Joseph Graves. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I caught myself here. Join us on the second Thursday of January, which is January 12th, when our speaker will be Dr. Joseph Graves, an evolutionary biologist at North Carolina A&T. His talk is titled Racism, Not Race, Answers to Questions Even a Skeptic Might Ask. So join us and ask questions or not as you see fit, but come by. And meanwhile, have a very happy holiday season and see you next month. Goodbye now.